A State in 11 Minutes. How the U.S. Created Israel. No, this isn't the title of a Netflix thriller. It's a historical fact. The United States recognized Israel's independence just 11 minutes after it was declared. Harry Truman, then President of the U.S., signed the recognition statement so quickly that the State Department barely had time to react. But was it a spontaneous political impulse, or one of the most calculated, meticulously prepared diplomatic moves of the 20th century? Picture this. It's the late 1940s. The world is recovering from World War II. Europe is home to millions of displaced persons, including Jewish survivors who have lost everything. In Palestine, a British colonial administration struggles with Arab revolts and Jewish underground forces. This wasn't an accident. It was the climax of decades of lobbying, electoral calculations, ideological battles, and deep-seated fears. Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy thoughtful, slow-burning stories that won't fit into a neat little series. And tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. We'd love to know from which corners of the world you're joining us. Behind those 11 minutes lay years of pressure on the UN, the British, and Arab monarchs. Agreements, conspiracies, elections in New York, and spies in Tel Aviv. States don't just appear out of nowhere. States are launched, created, or allowed to emerge. This is the story of how the U.S. decided to become the midwife to a brand new nation in the most combustible region on the planet. Buckle up, because we're heading into the first real twist. What happened to Palestine before it became a footnote? In 1882, Ottoman census records showed that around 450,000 people lived in Palestine. Of these, only about 5% were Jews. The rest were Arabs, Muslims, Christians, Bedouins, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, people with Ottoman passports who baked bread, married off their children, and irrigated their fields. The land, later described as empty, was in fact populated with its own social fabric, clan structures, religious communities, customs, languages, and lullabies. Then came the phrase that became a myth: a land without a people for a people without a land. Attributed variously to European politicians and early Zionist thinkers, the phrase served one purpose: to justify colonization. If the land is empty, then no one is being displaced. If there is no people, then there's no nation, and no state worthy of recognition. In reality, Palestine between 1917 and 1947 was a laboratory of imperial conflict. After World War I, Britain received the mandate over Palestine from the League of Nations and behaved like a colonial administrator with good manners and bad intentions. The Balfour Declaration, 1917, which promised a national home for the Jewish people, was a diplomatic Schrödinger's cat. It could be interpreted in any way. Zionists saw it as a green light for a future state. The British saw it as a vague pledge. The Arabs as a betrayal. In the 1920s and 1930s, waves of Jewish immigration, especially from Poland, Germany, and the USSR, began shifting the region's demographic balance. Jewish communities built the Yishuv, a parallel infrastructure, schools, hospitals, agricultural collectives, kibbutzim, and paramilitary organizations, Haganah, and later Irgun and Lehi. This was not integration, it was a state in waiting. Arab Palestinians began to sense that their future was slipping away. From 1936 to 1939, they launched the Great Arab Revolt, crushed brutally with the help of British forces. Britain, ever the imperial balancer, tried appeasing both sides, making promises in all directions to maintain control. Meanwhile, a new image took hold, the Arab as an obstructionist, a traditionalist, impeding progress. This caricature was useful. It was fueled by British reports, European newspapers, and Zionist propaganda. It made the occupation look like reform. Palestine was no longer a society. It was a backward space waiting to be enlightened. But the numbers tell another story. By 1947, there were over 1.3 million Arab Palestinians. Jews numbered about 600,000. And yet, the issue was no longer demographics. It was hegemony. Who would rule the future? This was not a clash of equals. It was a layered historical shift where one group had the backing of empires, global lobbies, and ideology, and the other was just a weak dot on the map. Next chapter, how the Holocaust changed American politics. In 1942, the first reports of mass killings of Jews in Europe began appearing in the American press. But these stories were often lost amid the flood of wartime news. Even when leaders of Zionist organizations brought evidence directly to the White House, the official response remained cautious. President Roosevelt chose silence, at least publicly. At the time, America was fighting a global war on two fronts. The public, still influenced by isolationist sentiment, was hesitant to be drawn into new causes. More significantly, Congress and political elites feared being accused of meddling in the so-called Jewish question. Anti-Semitism, though more discreet, was still present in Washington. Meanwhile, in cities like New York, Hollywood, and Chicago, a wave of protest was rising. Newspapers, rallies, manifestos. Young rabbis marched to the Capitol. Activists, many of them children of European immigrants, formed rescue committees, funded missions, and launched public awareness campaigns. They weren't just trying to save family members. They were reshaping the public narrative. One of the most influential figures was Peter Bergson, real name Hillel Kook. He organized theatrical demonstrations, bought ads in the New York Times, and forced members of Congress to hear testimony from genocide survivors. In 1943, a group of Jewish refugees staged a March of the Living through Washington, at a time when political marches were far from common. The government responded slowly, but pressure was building. In 1944, the U.S. created the War Refugee Board, the first official effort to save Jewish lives. It came late, had limited reach, but was symbolically important. America was waking up. And here lies a paradox. Just as the world was horrified by the Holocaust, the idea of America's moral responsibility toward the Jewish people took shape. That responsibility was soon converted into support for a Jewish state. Why? Because it was simpler. Saving everyone was complex, granting visas politically risky, but recognizing Israel was a noble, symbolic gesture. Crucially, it didn't require domestic reforms. By 1945, President Harry Truman faced a choice. Heed his diplomats, who warned against angering the Arab world, or listen to public opinion, now ready for an act of atonement. Truman chose the latter. After World War II, the Middle East became the chessboard of a new era. Britain, long accustomed to playing white, with colonial experience, silk protocols, and imperial confidence, was suddenly matched by a new player, the United States. America's pieces weren't military garrisons, but dollars, UN votes, and moral rhetoric. In the 1940s, Britain was caught in the web of its own contradictions. The 1917 Balfour Declaration promised a national home for the Jewish people. At the same time, British authorities had made conflicting promises to Arab leaders, expecting that Palestine would remain Arab. The British mandate faced daily explosions, sabotage, and unrest. By 1946, the British government desperately wanted to rid itself of what it now called the Palestine burden. Washington sensed this and seized the opportunity. President Harry Truman publicly pressured Britain to admit 100,000 Jewish refugees into Palestine. The British resisted, fearing the move would trigger another Arab revolt. In response, the U.S. activated Plan B, a full-court diplomatic press through the United Nations. In 1947, the UN Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, was formed, made up of representatives from 11 smaller nations. The committee proposed dividing Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. Jerusalem would become an international city. Arab states opposed the plan entirely. Zionist groups supported it, and so did, quite passionately, the United States. American influence went beyond politics. It was material. Behind closed doors, U.S. diplomats reportedly applied pressure on neutral countries such as Liberia, Haiti, and the Philippines. Some delegates were warned that foreign aid could be cut if they voted the wrong way. It was democracy with an asterisk. Idealism paired with intimidation. But formal diplomacy wasn't the only game in town. One of the decisive forces came from within the U.S. itself, the Jewish lobby, already a significant political player in cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Wealthy businessmen, lawyers, and Hollywood moguls didn't just fund Zionist efforts. They helped shape American media, influence Congress, and reach the White House. A key figure was Eddie Jacobson, President Truman's old business partner. Jacobson personally convinced Truman to meet with Chaim Weizmann, the future first president of Israel, at a critical moment in the debate. Truman was no idealist. He was a realist. With the 1948 election on the horizon, securing Jewish American support, both electoral and financial, became a strategic priority. Thus, moral responsibility after the Holocaust, human rights rhetoric, rivalry with Britain, and domestic political calculus all aligned at the right time. In November 1947, the UN General Assembly voted 33 in favor, 13 against, 10 abstentions. The partition plan passed. The Soviet Union also voted yes, not out of Zionist sympathy, but in hopes of pushing Britain out of the region. Ironically, Britain, the original sponsor of the Jewish national home, opposed its realization, while the U.S., until recently indifferent, emerged as the driving force. Washington didn't just win a diplomatic battle, it dislodged an empire that had ruled the region for more than 30 years. May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declares the independence of Israel. 11 minutes later, Harry Truman recognizes the new state. That number, 11, became a symbol of immediacy, but behind it was a far more complex story. Not just a diplomatic gesture, but a clear signal to the world that America was placing its bet on a new player in the Middle East. While Truman publicly called for neutrality and peace, other mechanisms were already at work in Washington. The State Department and the Pentagon remained cautious. But the CIA, informal channels, private funds, and lobbying networks were already mobilizing to support the fledgling state. Just days after its founding, Israel found itself under siege. The armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon invaded what had been mandatory Palestine. Jerusalem was under fire. Roads were blocked. To many, it looked like Israel might be a short-lived experiment. But this experiment had long been prepared. Military infrastructure, an economic system, and international contacts were all in place. And there was American support, both official and unofficial. Officially, the U.S. was under an arms embargo on conflict zones. In practice, however, Israel received aircraft, rifles, and ammunition via European intermediaries, Czech factories, with Moscow's blessing, and American donors. Humanitarian shipments left New York packed with weapons. Former U.S. military volunteers, mechanics, pilots, engineers came to Israel to assist. One of them, Al Schwimmer, flew bombing missions over the Galilee. This was no longer just sympathy. It was a covert military alliance. Truman maintained personal contact with the Israeli embassy. Ben-Gurion sent letters requesting assistance and often received responses not through formal diplomatic channels, but via lawyers, businessmen, and journalists. As early as 1949, Israel began research into nuclear energy. Officially, the goal was electrification of the desert, but already U.S. intelligence reports were mentioning Dimona, the future hub of Israel's nuclear program. Washington said nothing publicly, but behind the scenes it knew and looked the other way. A young Israel was now viewed as a strategic outpost, a democracy among deserts, as Congress liked to say. What started as an 11-minute recognition evolved into a strategic marriage, with all its benefits, shadows, and unspoken vows. In May 1948, a new state was born, Israel. At the same time, a catastrophe began, which Palestinians call Nakba, the disaster, the ruin. Over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were expelled or fled their homes. Entire villages vanished from the map, sometimes physically destroyed, sometimes renamed, built over, or simply erased from memory. In the Western narrative, 1948 marks the triumph of the Jewish state. In the Palestinian memory, it marks the beginning of a historical homelessness. People lost not just homes, but legal status. They became stateless refugees without citizenship, passports, or the right of return. Dozens of camps in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and the West Bank became permanent settlements and eventually political symbols. And the Arab world, outraged, at least on paper. Their armies did indeed invade Palestine in 1948, but each country had its own agenda. Jordan wanted the West Bank. Egypt sought control over Gaza. Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon acted more for show than strategy. The dream of Arab unity shattered against the rocks of regional rivalry. Palestinian Arabs became pawns in other people's games. Meanwhile, the United States was drawing its own line. While publicly pledging neutrality, Washington adopted a very pragmatic silence, doing nothing as Israel secured territories that, under the UN plan, were meant for a future Palestinian state. Arab appeals to the UN led nowhere. For America, the Palestinian tragedy was seen not only as a humanitarian issue, but increasingly as a threat to regional stability. The response was non-intervention. Worse still, the new state of Israel quickly became a media darling. The image of a small democratic nation surrounded by enemies resonated with Western ideals of good and evil. Palestinians, meanwhile, had no voice, no representation. organized Palestinian political movements wouldn't emerge for decades. Back then, they were simply a people made invisible. History, as they say, is written by the victors. But Nakba was more than a defeat. It was an erasure of political identity, one that continues not as a moment, but as a condition. In the 1950s and 60s, Israel was still a young, unstable state. By the end of the century, it had become America's key ally in one of the world's most volatile regions. What changed? Everything. After World War II, the U.S. stepped into the role of global arbiter. In the Middle East, it needed a partner, not just a country with an embassy, but a strategic outpost that could help contain the USSR, secure oil routes, and shape acceptable regional policies. Initially, the U.S. looked to Iran under the Shah, or Saudi Arabia. But Israel, despite its size, offered something unique: a stable, at least on paper, democracy, a capable military, Western-style governance, and most importantly, loyalty in every vote, operation, and decision. In 1967, after the Six-Day War, Israel moved from being a sympathetic experiment to a strategic asset. In a lightning campaign, it defeated several Arab armies, proving that it could hold its own, but wouldn't mind some help. From that moment, U.S. military aid skyrocketed. Billions of dollars in tanks, fighter jets, radar systems, and missile defense. American generals began calling Israel the U.S. aircraft carrier in the Middle East, one that doesn't need to be moved. But the alliance wasn't just military. In the 1980s, the U.S. and Israel began deep cooperation in tech, intelligence, and cyber warfare. Together, they developed drones, exchanged Middle East intel, and co-engineered new weapon systems. Israel slowly became a research and development lab for the American military-industrial complex. The alliance also had an ideological core. For the U.S. conservative establishment, Israel symbolized civilizational superiority amid a sea of dictatorships. For evangelical Christians, it fulfilled biblical prophecy. For politicians, it was a digital vault of votes and campaign donations. Everyone found their angle. When Israel bombed Iraq's nuclear reactor in 1981, the U.S. officially expressed concern. Unofficially, it breathed a sigh of relief. This pattern would repeat. Modern parallels: support, protests, and Palestine in the shadows. In the 1960s through the 1980s, U.S. support for Israel was a geopolitical doctrine. In the 21st century, that doctrine is starting to tremble. On paper, things remain solid. Israel receives about $3.8 billion in annual military aid, much of which cycles back into American defense industries. Congress applauds. Presidents sign memorandums. Diplomats smile for the cameras. But beneath the surface, something is shifting. A generation raised after 9/11 views foreign policy through a different lens. Students at Harvard, Georgetown, or UCLA no longer automatically see Israel as the civilized side. Social media platforms are filled with footage from Gaza, stories of Palestinian children, and disappearing Arab villages on shrinking maps. TikTok and Instagram are shaping a new emotional geopolitics. New voices in Congress are speaking up. Progressive Democrats who criticize Israeli policies and call for re-evaluation of U.S. aid. The BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions, is gaining traction, even as some U.S. states attempt to ban it. A striking new development is the internal division within American Jewish communities. Many younger Jews feel a growing disconnect between their identity and the actions of the Israeli government. Some become vocal advocates for Palestinian rights. Some ask openly, does being Jewish necessarily mean supporting a state that builds separation walls? Yet, U.S. official policy remains nearly unchanged. Why? First, inertia. Second, electoral strategy. Supporting Israel still plays well in both parties. Third, the fear of being labeled anti-Semitic. In this context, Palestine continues to exist as a shadow, a sensitive topic, often met with nervous silence, awkward laughs, or ritual phrases about the complexity of the conflict. The years 2023 and 2024 only intensified this trend. Campus protests, building occupations, public media clashes, all point to one thing. Something is changing. But how fast? And in what direction? From Washington's point of view, a map of the Middle East shows Israel not just as an ally, it is a command center, a watchtower, a modem that keeps America connected to a region that might otherwise be chaotic and unpredictable. Since the Cold War, Israel has transformed from a protected partner into a strategic tool. Through Israel, the U.S. contains Iran, keeping the regional balance in check, monitors Syria, including via joint operations and airstrikes, exerts pressure on Jordan and Lebanon, reminding them of the risks of aligning too closely with Tehran or Moscow. Joint military drills, tech exchanges, real-time intelligence sharing, all of this makes Israel a regional server for American interests. Under the banner of counterterrorism, the U.S. gains unique access to Middle Eastern affairs through Israel without direct involvement in every local conflict. Another mechanism is arms distribution. Israel not only consumes U.S. weaponry, it also re-exports American technologies to third-party allies. From India to Africa, Israeli drones, radars, and software operate where an American presence might be seen as overt intervention. Israel has also become a trusted political mediator. In conflicts in Sudan, Ethiopia, or even among Gulf monarchies, Israeli intelligence, with Washington's quiet approval, delivers messages, floats proposals, and lays the groundwork for negotiation. Especially since 2020, following the Abraham Accords, which formalized ties between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. Israel has become a regional hub. The U.S. has effectively delegated it the role of Arab Affairs Manager, one who keeps regional turbulence under control and rivals like Moscow and Beijing at bay. The system works quietly but efficiently. It's convenient. Minimal U.S. troop presence, maximum influence. And if a new crisis erupts tomorrow, Israel will be the first to respond. America will simply reaffirm, we stand with our ally. The story of Israel is not just about a people returning to their ancestral land. It's about how states are created in the age of diplomacy, media, and military calculus. If you're looking for a simple moral here, you won't find one. This isn't a fable. It's a chronicle of realpolitik. Yes, Israel is the outcome of centuries of longing, the tragedy of the Holocaust, and the journey of millions of displaced people. But it's also the product of backroom deals, American influence, and geopolitical planning in which Palestine became collateral in a cartographic war. This state was launched. It didn't simply appear. It was negotiated, shielded, recognized, often before its legal structure even solidified. There was no magic, only strategy. The question is not whether Israel had a right to exist. The question is, at what cost that existence was secured? And who paid? The refugees, the region's political stability, the ideals of international law. But the sharpest question is contemporary. Can a state still be born this way in the 21st century? Through a UN vote, lobbying pressure, and a support package from a superpower? We now live in a world where statehood is less about territory and more about recognition, less about armies and more about narratives, less about capitals and more about geopolitical function. In this sense, Israel is not an exception. It is a prototype. Palestine still waits. In camps, in UN resolutions, in emotional debates, and in the shadows of history. It exists, but as a possibility, not a fact. The story of Israel is not only the story of the Jewish people. It is a story about who gets to be called a people, who gets a state, and who gets sympathy. Mossad, Israel's invisible hand. Picture a night in Tehran, 2018. A group infiltrates a heavily guarded government warehouse. They have 6 hours. They crack safes, download files, steal hard drives, and vanish. The Iranian regime doesn't notice until the next day. When they return to the site, they find a single sheet of paper. It reads, "Greetings from Mossad." This isn't a movie plot. It's real, and it's just one episode in the story of how a nation the size of New Jersey became a legend in global espionage. Thank you for being here. Subscribe to our channel if you love deep, slow-burn stories about invisible wars, giant paradoxes, and moral dilemmas. And let us know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? We truly want to map our global audience. In 1948, when the UN proclaimed the creation of the State of Israel, war erupted around the newborn country. 5 Arab armies, millions of enemies, total international isolation. Israel was born under siege. And the first realization in Tel Aviv was clear. To survive, we must know. Israel had no real army, no allies, but it had the memory of the Holocaust. And that memory became strategy. Never again wasn't a slogan. It was an operational directive. Their early years weren't about tuxedo-clad spies. They were about chaos, improvisation, and constant fear. Jewish survivors from Europe with underground experience became analysts. Former concentration camp inmates, counterintelligence agents. Mossad was officially founded in 1949 under the codename Institute for Coordination. It wasn't an agency in the Western sense. It was a hybrid: analysis, espionage, diplomacy, smuggling. Its first leader, Reuven Shiloh, the son of a Jerusalem rabbi, believed that the war for survival won't be won by weapons, but by information. Mossad began with logistics, smuggling Jews out of Arab countries, buying arms on the European black market, gathering intelligence through diplomatic circles. By 1951, they already had operatives in France, Iran, and Turkey. But the main target was Egypt, where war was brewing and Mossad needed to know everything. Early successes came from courage and lack of rules. Mossad didn't fear risk because the alternative was the death of the state. This gave birth to the philosophy that still shapes Israeli intelligence. Better to know imperfectly than not to know at all. In 1960, an El Al aircraft landed in Tel Aviv. On board was a man with glasses, traveling under a false name. His face would soon be seen by millions at a historic trial in Jerusalem. This was Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust, abducted from Argentina. The operation was executed by Mossad. This wasn't just a manhunt. It was an act of remembrance. Every agent involved had a personal story. Families lost, camps survived, exile endured. Yet they acted with precision, not emotion. Surveillance was meticulous. The route mapped, the identity confirmed. When the time came, they grabbed him, injected a sedative, and smuggled him out of the country disguised as an airline technician. Eichmann's trial became a defining moment for Israel, not only because he symbolized the Holocaust, but because Mossad had sent a message: Israel does not forget. Not after 15 years, not even across continents. But Eichmann was just one of many. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Mossad aggressively tracked Nazis across South America, Syria, Egypt. Scientists were a special focus. Former Nazi chemists were helping Egypt develop missiles. Mossad viewed them as threats equal to tanks, poisonings, sabotage, intimidation. Mossad operated without much sentimentality. Some operations were sharp, others messy. In 1962, they tried to poison a German scientist, but hit the wrong person. Even within Israel's government, this raised questions. Where is the line between justice and vengeance? Inside Mossad, the answer was simple. We don't seek revenge. We prevent recurrence. And while Mossad's history is filled with high-stakes operations, it was the Nazi hunts that forged its core doctrine. The enemy can be anywhere. So can we. The 1972 Olympic Games in Munich were meant to symbolize peace. But on the morning of September 5th, everything changed. The Palestinian group Black September took Israeli athletes hostage. It ended in blood. 11 Israelis were killed. The Israeli government was in shock. The people in fury. Mossad received a command that was never formally written. Avenge them. All of them. No exceptions. Thus began Operation Wrath of God, a years-long manhunt for the planners, logisticians, and even sympathizers of the attack. No trial, no warning, just a list and death. Mossad agents traveled across Europe, Italy, France, Norway, Lebanon. They used forged passports, changed hairstyles, lived in hotels as tourists. Surveillance could take weeks. The operation happened in plain sight and remained in the shadows. But not everything went according to plan. In 1973, in the Norwegian town of Lillehammer, Mossad killed the wrong man. The victim was a Moroccan waiter, mistaken for a leader of Black September. The agents were arrested. The scandal exploded. The world didn't learn about Mossad through heroic headlines, but through murder charges. Inside Israel, debate erupted. Does a state have the right to act as judge, jury, and executioner? Does this policy not breed the next wave of hatred? But Mossad carried on. By the late 1980s, most of those linked to Munich were dead. Wrath of God became the symbol of Mossad's style: slow, relentless, silent. Israel does not wait. Israel does not forget. And while the world speaks of diplomacy, Mossad is already mapping escape routes for the man who's grown too confident in his impunity. Israel has never officially admitted to possessing nuclear weapons, but everyone knows, especially those who tried to stop it. In the 1950s, Israel began building a nuclear reactor in Dimona. Officially, it was for research. Unofficially, it was with help from France, under secret agreements, driven by mutual fear of the Arab world. The French provided the technology, and the Israelis mastered the art of concealment. To keep the program in the shadows, Israel didn't just need defense, it needed active counterintelligence. That's where Mossad stepped in. One of the most famous cases was that of Mordecai Vanunu. In 1986, this Dimona technician leaked photos and data about Israel's nuclear arsenal to the British press. The world was stunned, but not for long. Mossad lured Vanunu to Rome using an agent known as Cindy, drugged him, and smuggled him back to Tel Aviv. He was tried for treason and sentenced to 18 years. For Mossad, this wasn't just a success, it was a warning. Those who speak too much disappear. But the biggest battles happened not inside Israel, but beyond its borders. In 1981, Israel launched an airstrike on Iraq's nuclear reactor, Operation Opera. But long before the bombs dropped, Mossad had gathered intel, the site's layout, guard rotations, the names of every engineer. The strike was made possible by years of espionage. A similar story unfolded with Iran. Since the 2000s, Mossad has systematically eliminated scientists involved in Iran's nuclear program. Magnetic bombs, motorcycle snipers, drones, each strike tailored to precision. In 2018, agents stole Iran's nuclear archive from the heart of Tehran. It wasn't just a heist, it was a message. Inside the facility, they left a note. Greetings from Tel Aviv. The nuclear war may never happen, but the war over the right to own the bomb that no one admits exists has long been underway. And in that war, Mossad is not a silent observer. It's the director of a film that must never reach the screen. In the 1960s, Mossad had an agent deep inside the Syrian government. His name was Eli Cohen, an Argentine Jew turned wealthy Syrian businessman. Ministers welcomed him. He hosted parties. He gave defense advice, including suggestions like don't plant trees that block views on the Golan Heights. Later, when Israel attacked Syria, those clear lines of sight became a tactical advantage. Cohen transmitted data via radio and gathered intelligence disguised as casual conversation. He became a legend, but he was caught, executed. To this day, monuments in Israel honor him. And within Mossad, they still say, we had everything, except the time to save him. Fast forward to 2018 when Mossad agents stole Iran's nuclear archive straight from Tehran. Hundreds of kilos of documents, hard drives, blueprints. They had 6 hours and made it out. It was like a bank heist, only instead of cash, they took secrets that could shift geopolitics. They left behind a note. Bond would have blushed. But not all stories end in glory. In Lillehammer, Norway in 1973, Mossad killed the wrong man, a Moroccan waiter living in a suspicious area. It was a diplomatic scandal. Agents were arrested and tried. Mossad, usually cloaked in silence, suddenly found itself center stage, and not by choice. Another case, 1997, Jordan. A failed attempt to poison a Hamas leader. Agents were caught. To get them released, Israel had to deliver the antidote. It wasn't just a blunder, it was almost a parody. Yet through it all, Mossad didn't weaken. Each failure only reinforced its defining creed. We operate where others don't even begin. And when things go wrong, they can always mutter, this isn't a failure, it's just what invisible war looks like when someone turns on the lights. When Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, one of the key architects of Iran's nuclear program, was assassinated in 2020, the world immediately suspected who was behind it. Officially, no comment. Unofficially, all signs pointed to Mossad. This wasn't just a precision strike. It was a technological statement, a remote-controlled machine gun mounted on a pickup truck, guided by artificial intelligence. No agents on site, no witnesses, just a distant button press and death. Today's Mossad is no longer just wigs and forged passports. It's headphones and algorithms. It's hackers, analysts, and engineers crafting virtual identities. It doesn't merely infiltrate enemy nations. It hacks their reality. The conflict with Iran hasn't ended. It's simply evolved. Targeted assassinations, cyber attacks on centrifuges, explosions in underground facilities, all unofficial, unsigned, just shadows. But Iran isn't the only focus. Hamas, Qatar, Lebanon, Syria. Today's map of enemies is more complex, and Mossad more agile. It partners with tech giants, uses AI to predict behavior, builds fake accounts, and recruits online. This is no longer just espionage. It's operations in the infosphere, where data is a weapon. But a new dilemma emerges. Can a democracy operate beyond the law in the name of national survival? And if so, who watches the agents who claim no jurisdiction? In the 21st century, Mossad is no longer merely an agency. It's a philosophy, a belief that hostility is a permanent state, and silence just a brief pause before the next mission. In June 1976, passengers on an Air France flight from Tel Aviv to Paris boarded unaware they'd soon be hostages at the far end of Africa. The plane would be hijacked, diverted, and eventually land in Entebbe, an airport in Uganda ruled by Idi Amin, a bloodthirsty dictator and friend of the terrorists. The world would call for negotiations. Israel would say, no negotiations, because if we give in once, no one ever flies without fear again. Thank you for staying with us. Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy dramatic stories where geography, military strategy, and human courage collide at a single point. And don't forget to tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what you think. Was the risk worth it? June 27, 1976. Air France Flight 139, 248 passengers, 12 crew. Standard route, Tel Aviv, Athens, Paris. But in Athens, 4 new passengers board, 2 Germans, 2 Palestinians. An hour after takeoff, they pull out guns, seize the cockpit, change the route. A game with no rules begins. First, the plane lands in Libya, refueling. Then it's off to Entebbe, Uganda. Why there? Because that's Idi Amin's turf. And he helps. It's absurd. An international hijacking, and one country's government provides the runway, security, even a welcome from its leader. Amin presents himself as a mediator, but he's clearly on the side of those with the guns. The hijackers issue an ultimatum. Israel must release over 50 Palestinian prisoners, or they'll start executing hostages in 72 hours. Then it gets worse. They conduct a selection. They separate Israelis and Jews. The others, French, Germans, Americans, are placed aside. This is no longer just terrorism. This is history echoing in horror. In Israel, a painful reflex kicks in. Jews are being separated again. Again. Lists. Again. Camps. Again. Waiting for death. The world debates negotiations, but in Israel, a plan begins to form. A plan for the impossible. In Jerusalem, feverish tension. The cabinet is split. Some demand negotiations. Others insist, we cannot become a country that pays terrorists. But one group works in silence. Military intelligence, Sayeret Matkal, Israel's elite special forces who carry out operations so secret they vanish, even from archives. They begin analyzing the Entebbe airport, old British blueprints. Ugandans haven't changed a thing. Among the hostages is a retired Israeli Air Force engineer. He memorized the layout and passes it on. Mossad gathers satellite photos and agent intel. The puzzle starts to form. The plan is madness. Fly 4,000 kilometers deep into Africa in Hercules transport planes. No official permission, no warning to the world. Land by night, storm the terminal, rescue hostages, and fly out, all within 90 minutes. But that's not all. To avoid suspicion, one of the vehicles in the cargo hold is a black Mercedes, mimicking Idi Amin's motorcade. The plan: drive up to the terminal using the power of illusion. On the night of July 3rd to 4th, 1976, the planes take off. Lights off, flying at low altitude beneath radar over hostile lands. One mistake, total catastrophe. Leading the unit is Yonatan Netanyahu, an officer and brother of a future prime minister. He knows not all will return, but retreat is not an option. The planes land at 23:01. Total darkness. The first minute is all illusion. A black Mercedes rolls out of the cargo bay. Ugandan guards freeze. They think Idi Amin has arrived. But 20 seconds later, gunfire erupts. The commandos rush from the planes. They storm the terminal building. There's no time, any delay, and the terrorists might begin killing hostages. It all lasts 53 minutes. All the hijackers are killed. Ugandan guards eliminated. 102 out of 106 hostages are rescued. Israel suffers one fatality. Yonatan Netanyahu, the unit's commander, is killed first, leading the charge. His death transforms the mission from a military operation into a national legend. After the raid, global outrage. Uganda calls it an act of aggression. The UN stammers, but the world watches in awe. Israel just proved that no citizen is beyond reach. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a message. We will never return to a world where Jews are sorted by lists. Entebbe marked a turning point. Israel was no longer just a nation surviving. It became a nation that rescues and strikes. Mossad is not just an intelligence agency. It is the language Israel speaks when the world goes silent. It's a form of response to a question that echoes constantly in the ears of Israelis. What happens if we're left alone? Israel has no geographic depth, no luxury of long wars. Its primary strategy is preemption, and Mossad is the sharpest edge of that logic. It doesn't just seek information, it builds a reality where the enemy hesitates to act. Here lies the paradox. Mossad isn't about power, it's about fear. The fear that if you don't see the threat first, it will destroy you. So better to know, better to strike first, better to operate in the shadows. This creates a profound moral dilemma. Mossad crosses borders, it breaks laws, it violates trust, yet in doing so, it creates a space where its nation can breathe. It is criticized, it is feared, it is emulated. The CIA, MI6, even Chinese agencies study Mossad because this tiny state built more than an intelligence service. It built a legend where impossible doesn't exist, only operations that haven't begun. And today, in a world of drones, deep fakes, and artificial intelligence, Mossad still plays its old game. It stares into the future, using tools no one is allowed to see. We've just walked the darker corridors of history, tracing Mossad agents who moved at night, without names, beyond borders. Now, we open a new door into another dimension of Israel, one that's bright, open, and creative. How did a country born of refugee ships, with no oil, no water, and under constant threat of war, become a startup nation, a symbol of innovation? And what do Zionism, socialism, and kibbutzim have to do with it? Let's dive into our next story. Zionism, socialism, startups. How Israel turned a desert into Silicon Valley. Imagine a country where 60% of the land is desert, where instead of natural resources, there's only the looming threat of war, where the first settlers dreamed not of profits, but of purpose. And yet, this country is now one of the world's leading tech powers. This isn't fiction. This is Israel. Thank you for joining us. Subscribe to our channel if you enjoy slow-burning stories about how ideas become weapons and dreams become technologies. And please tell us in the comments, what city are you listening from and what time is it there? We truly want to feel the geography of our community. This time, we won't talk about Mossad or war. We're diving into something just as astonishing, an economic miracle that wasn't supposed to happen. How a country burdened with limitations, crises, and a semi-socialist model created a startup culture that inspires the world. We begin at the roots, with what Zionism, kibbutzim, and the mobilized economy really meant. Because Israel's future didn't grow from oil. It grew from an idea that survival must come through innovation. When Israel declared independence in 1948, it had everything except the obvious. No water, no oil, no infrastructure, no guarantee it would still exist tomorrow. What did it have? An idea, an ideology, and a bit of desperation. In its early decades, Israel operated under a logic of mobilization. Everything was about survival. The military, the economy, education, they weren't separate systems. They were one mechanism. Civilians went to the front. Soldiers went to the kibbutz fields. Kibbutzim weren't just communal dining halls and shared socks. They were socialist experiments, where mutual support was a core value. Here, people tested models of collective labor, resource distribution, and technological self-reliance. No fuel? Invent drip irrigation. No vehicles? Rebuild old tanks by hand. Israel couldn't afford to buy solutions. It had to invent them. The Army, especially Unit 8200, wasn't just a defense force. It became an incubator of engineering creativity. Young people aged 18 to 21 were granted access to advanced tech, analytics, and cryptography. They didn't just protect, they improvised, innovated, experimented. This created a unique ecosystem where every crisis was a call to invent, where every soldier was a potential CTO. The idea of survival through innovation became the nation's DNA. In the 1950s, Israel's per capita GDP resembled Turkey's. Today, it rivals Switzerland's. And it all started with a country that chose to invest in brains, because that was all it had. In the 1990s, Israel looked like a post-explosion lab. Over 1 million new citizens, mostly immigrants from the Soviet Union. They didn't bring wealth, but they brought degrees, technical education, and experience from research institutes where everything was lacking, except brain power. This demographic boom collided perfectly with the global rise of IT. To the world, Israel still looked like a military outpost, but in reality, it was a country developing firewalls, encryption algorithms, systems for stock markets and banks. The government didn't sit back. In 1993, it launched YASMA, a public venture fund that encouraged private investors to take risks in tech. It was a rare case of government fueling risk instead of fearing it. The result? By the late 1990s, Israel had become one of the top 3 startup hubs on the planet, alongside Silicon Valley and Shenzhen. But what was the secret? Culture. In Israel, failure wasn't feared, authority wasn't worshipped. A 20-year-old student could challenge a department head in a pitch, and that was normal. A failed startup? No big deal, just rehearsal for the next one. The Army had already instilled a mindset of think independently, act fast. That carried into business. Startups were agile, aggressive, and hungry. At the same time, Silicon Valley started betting on Israel. Major corporations, Intel, Microsoft, Google, opened R&D centers there because they realized in this country, innovation isn't fashion. It's a survival instinct. Israel has no oil, but it has something the world wants even more: intellect. Today, a country smaller than New York has over 6,000 startups, and most of them aren't just apps or games. They're solutions to global problems: security, water, energy, medicine, agritech. Technology has become for Israel what navies and armies are for others: geopolitical currency. Countries that once condemned Israel at the UN now buy its cybersecurity systems, anti-drone tech, biotech. Knowledge has become a new weapon, but not without cost. Much of this innovation comes from the military-industrial complex. Some startups are direct spin-offs from Army units. This raises the question: where is the line between defense and surveillance? Israeli tech is used around the world, sometimes in authoritarian regimes for control and political stability. Inside the country, inequality is rising. While the high-tech sector generates billions, other parts of the economy lag behind. Israel is no longer just a survival state. It's a country of technological divides. And yet, Israel remains a symbol that survival can drive progress, that even a desert can become a Silicon Valley, and that sometimes the best response to a threat isn't a tank, but an open-source platform. Thank you for joining us on this deep journey through the story of Israel, from political intrigues and the birth of a state, through the shadows of Mossad, to desert-born startups and lightning-fast military raids. This wasn't just a chronology. It was an attempt to understand how one nation turns fear into technology, trauma into determination, and every challenge into a reason to act first. Subscribe to our channel if you want more slow-burning, deeply researched stories where world history comes alive, unvarnished, dramatic, ironic, and grounded in fact. And don't forget to let us know in the comments which part of Israel's story struck you most and what you'd like to hear about next.